Hello friends, Rahul Jha welcomes you. Today we are going to talk on topic can India become 9 trillion economy? So let's start. What is relation between price of goods and services to GDP in a country? The relationship between the price of goods and services often measured through price indices like consumer price index, CPI and gross domestic product GDP in a country is a complex and multifaceted. Here are some key aspects of this relationship. Inflation and real GDP. Inflation. Inflation is the rate at which general level of prices of goods and services is rising. When prices rise due to inflation, the nominal GDP, which measures the value of all finished goods and services produced within a country using current prices, will increase. Real GDP. To account for inflation, economists use real GDP, which adjusts nominal GDP for changes in price level. Real GDP provides a more accurate reflection of an economy size and how it's growing over time. Purchasing power and GDP. Higher prices reduce the purchasing power of consumers, meaning they can buy less with the same amount of money. This can lead to decreased consumption if wages do not keep pace with rising prices, potentially slowing down GDP growth. Conversely, if wages rise along with prices, consumption may not be significantly affected, and GDP growth can continue at a steady pace. Consumer spending and aggregate demand. Consumer spending is a major component of GDP. If the prices of goods and services rise but consumers continue to spend, they can contribute positively to GDP. However, if price increases leads to reduced consumer spending, this can negatively impact GDP. Cost push and demand pull inflation. Cost push inflation. When the prices of inputs like raw material and labor increase, producers may raise prices to maintain profit margins, leading to higher prices for consumers. This can slow economic growth if higher costs reduce production. Demand pull inflation. When demand for goods and services exceeds supply, price rise. Price rises. This often associated with strong economic growth and can initially boost GDP. Monetary policy. Central bank monitor inflation as part of their mandate to ensure economic stability. They may adjust increased rate to influence inflation and economic growth. For example, higher interest rate can reduce inflation but may also slow down GDP growth by making borrowing more expensive. International competitiveness. Rising prices can affect a country's competitiveness in international markets. If domestic goods and services become more expensive relative to foreign goods and services, export may decline, impacting GDP negatively. In summary, the relationship between price of goods and services and GDP is dynamic. Prices influence consumer behavior, production costs, and overall economic stability, all of which feedback into GDP growth. What will be effect of GDP in a year if price of every goods and services is increased by 3 times in India? If the price of every good and services in India were to increase by 3 times in a single year, it would have significant and wide-ranging effects on country's GDP. Here are the key potential impacts. Nominal GDP increase. Nominal GDP, which measures the value of all goods and services produced within a country at current prices, would increase substantially. This is because the prices of goods and services are 3 times higher, inflating the nominal GDP figure. Real GDP decrease. Real GDP, which adjusts for inflation and reflects the true volume of production, would likely decrease. This is because such a dramatic increase in prices would likely lead to reduction in quantity of goods and services demanded and produced. Consumer spending decrease. The purchasing power of consumers would drastically decline as their incomes would not increase proportionally in the price surge. This would lead to a significant drop in consumer spending, which is a major component of GDP. Investment decrease. Businesses would face higher costs for inputs, reducing profit margins and potentially leading to lower level of investment. Uncertainty and reduced consumer demand would further discourage investment. Government spending uncertain. Government spending might increase if the government attempts to mitigate the effects of price surge through subsidies, social programs, or other fiscal measures. However, this would depend on government's fiscal capacity and policy decisions. Exports and imports. Decrease in exports. Indian goods would become much more expensive on the global market, leading to a decrease in exports as foreign buyers seek cheaper alternatives. Increase in imports. Imported goods would become relatively cheaper compared to domestic goods, potentially increasing import levels and further hurting domestic producers. Monetary policy tightening. The central bank RBI would likely tighten monetary policy to combat hyperinflation, potentially raising interest rates. This could further reduce consumer and business spending, deepening the economic slowdown. Overall economic stability. Negative impact. Such a drastic price increase would lead to economic instability, potentially causing a recession. Businesses may shut down due to unprofitability, unemployment could rise, and overall economic environment would be highly volatile. In summary, while nominal GDP would appear to increase due to tripling of prices, real GDP would likely contract significantly as consumer spending, investment, and exports decline. The overall effect would be highly negative, with the economy potentially entering into deep recession or economic crisis. In case count of every items and services purchased remains same, even in the case of three times price, what will be the effect on GDP? If the count of every item and services purchased remains the same, even when prices increase three times, the effects of GDP would be different from the scenario where consumption patterns change. Here's how it would impact GDP. Nominal GDP increase. Nominal GDP would increase significantly because it measures the total value of goods and services produced in the economy at current prices. If prices triple and quantities remain constant, the nominal GDP would triple as well. Real GDP unchanged. Real GDP measures the value of goods and services produced, adjusted for price changes. Since the quantity of goods and services remain unchanged, real GDP would stay the same. The adjustment for inflation would account for tripling of prices, leaving the real GDP figure unaffected. Purchasing power and inflation. Decrease in purchasing power. The purchasing power of money would decrease significantly as prices are three times higher. However, in this scenario, it is assumed that people continue to buy the same quantities despite higher prices. High inflation. The economy would experience hyperinflation as the general price level has increased dramatically in a short period. Wages and income. Necessary adjustment. For the consumption of same quantity of goods and services to be maintained, income would need to be adjusted proportionally. If wages and income do not rise, the assumption that people continue to buy the same quantities become unrealistic. Government revenue and spending. Increase in revenues. Government revenues from sale tax and other taxes that are percentage of prices would increase significantly due to higher nominal prices. Increased cost. Government spending would also increase if it continues to purchase the same quantity of goods and services at higher prices. Exports and imports. Competitiveness issue. Indian goods would become much more expensive in international market, potentially reducing export. Import would become relatively cheaper compared to domestic goods, leading to an increase in imports. Monetary policy tightening likely. The central bank would likely respond to hyperinflation by tightening monetary policy, raising interest rate to stabilize the currency and control inflation. In summary, under the assumption that the count of goods and services purchased remains the same despite a tripling of prices, nominal GDP would triple while real GDP would remain unchanged. However, the economy would face significant challenges, including hyperinflation, reduced purchasing power, and potential issues with international trade competitiveness. The central bank and government would need to take measures to stabilize the economy. In case GDP was 3 trillion and prices tripled, quantity of consumption remains same, what would be effect on GDP? If the GDP was 3 trillion and prices triple while the quantity of consumption remains the same, the effects on the nominal real GDP would be as follows. Nominal GDP increase. Nominal GDP measures the value of all finished goods and services produced within the country using current prices. If price triple and quantity of consumption remains the same, nominal GDP would also triple. Calculation: 3 trillion original nominal GDP multiplied by 3 price increase is equal to 9 trillion. Result: nominal GDP would increase to 9 trillion. Real GDP unchanged. Real GDP adjusts for the changes in price levels and reflects the true volume of production since the quantity of goods and services consumed remains the same. Real GDP would not change. Result: real GDP would remain $3 trillion, assuming it was also 3 trillion before the price change. Implications: inflation. The economy would experience hyperinflation as the price level has increased significantly. Purchasing power. The purchasing power of money would decline dramatically unless incomes also tripled to maintain the same standard of living. Economic policy. The central bank would likely need to intervene to control inflation through monetary policy, such as raising interest rates. International trade. Exports might decline due to higher prices of domestic goods, and imports might increase as foreign goods become relatively cheaper. In summary, with the price tripling and quantity of consumption remaining constant, nominal GDP would increase from 3 trillion to 9 trillion dollar, while real GDP would remain unchanged at 3 trillion dollar. So this was all about economy becoming 9 trillion dollar. Thanks.